Today we're covering Judges 8 and 9. And chapter 8 opens with the men of Ephraim wanting to argue with Gideon, and he wisely avoids a fight. He follows the principle in the first half of Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath. But in verse 7, he follows the second half of that proverb. A harsh word stirs up anger. He promises the men he will come back and kill them after taking care of the kings of Midian because they wouldn't provide food for the weary army with Gideon. The attitude of the men in verses 6 through 9 shows that there was a lack of unity in Israel. They didn't have faith in Gideon. They weren't sure he was going to win, and so they were afraid to help him in case he lost. And as we read in Numbers 32, these were the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan. At verses 9 through 20 of chapter 8, we see that Gideon's brothers were killed during a time of peace, probably while at work in the field. And so human nature is to get revenge, which is an act of the flesh. And so we kind of see Gideon's carnal nature showing in his pursuit. Vengeance is never satisfied with justice, it wants more. And sadly, his kids are watching him. We'll see in chapter 9 how Abimelech does some of the same things that Gideon did. We always have an audience, so we should always remember seek God first in every decision we make, so we aren't allowing the flesh to rule over our spirit, and make sure our focus is on God first above all else. God says, vengeance is mine, because he knows how to take care of the situations. He, with perfect justice, he sees the big picture, and he knows what's in the hearts of everyone involved in the situation. In verses 22 and 23, Gideon answers the people who want to make him king, saying, I will not rule over you, the Lord will rule over you. It sounded good, but Gideon ended up turning to idolatry. In verses 24 through 27, we see that the ephod that he made it became a snare. He didn't want the responsibility of being the king, yet he named his son Abimelech, which means my father is king. Gideon dies at the end of chapter 8, and Israel immediately forgets about God and returns to idolatry. So in chapter 9, it summarizes the life of Abimelech, the son that Gideon had with a concubine in Shechem. In Joshua 24, Shechem was a place where the covenant was made with the people, and Joshua said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And now in Judges 9, they are back to worshiping idols. And Mount Gerizim, mentioned in verse 7, was the mountain of blessing in Deuteronomy 27, verse 12. Abimelech wants to be king, so he kills Gideon's 70 sons on a stone, but one escapes, Jotham. In verses 8 through 15, Jotham shares the first parable that we see in Scripture. It's the first time we see figurative language to make a point. The parable is about a tree that wanted a king. A bunch of trees wanted a king. So they asked the olive tree. The olive tree represents Gideon. He did not want to be king. The fig tree and the grapevine represent the legitimate sons of Gideon. And the bramble, or the tumbleweed, represents Abimelech. So Jotham shares this parable. And in verses 15 and 20, it's actually a prophecy that speaks of fire that comes out of the bramble and destroys Shechem. And we'll see later on that prophecy is fulfilled. Verses 22 and 23 tell us that Abimelech was king for 3 years. And then verse 23 says God sent an evil spirit that brought strife between Abimelech and his followers. And Abimelech ends up killing his own people. Verse 49 is the fulfillment of that prophecy. In verses 15 and 20, Abimelech killed everyone in Shechem with fire. And then in verse 53, a certain woman drops a millstone over the wall. It hits Abimelech in the head, and he doesn't want to be known as someone who was killed by a woman, so he asks his cohort to kill him. So he dies in verse 57. And Galatians 6 says, be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that shall he reap. And Abimelech had killed the 70 sons of Gideon on a stone, and then he is killed by a stone. I just thought that was interesting. A promotion can be a demotion if God didn't call you to it. Abimelech never showed any evidence of following after God, but Gideon is mentioned in Hebrews' Hall of Faith, chapter 11, verse 32. For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith, that is, with enduring trust in God and his promises, subdued kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promised blessings, closed the mouths of lions, extinguished the power of raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became mighty and unbeatable in battle, putting the enemy forces to flight. So it's clear that God is pleased when we trust in Him and keep our eyes on Him.